Hi guys, welcome back to another tutorial series. This series is going to focus on different types of fur. So a lot of you have actually asked me to revisit this. I have done several different types of fur previously, but this is a more sort of in-depth, real look at each individual type. So the four types which I've got are short fur, long fur, wavy fur, curly fur and wiry fur. So all I've done for this is just set out 5 little circles. So they've got 5 of them here, you can't really see the bottom 2. But there are 5 different circles, exactly the same as sort of what I've set up on the little reference sheet for you. There isn't a line drawing for this purely because it's just circles, there's no like real outline that you need to do, and you can practice these not in circles, you can just practice on little squares or just little things that you've got to put down on your paper. But I've drawn circles as I've done with the little reference image for you. So for the short fur we've got some black fur. For the long fur it's sort of that really nice sort of creamy like wheaty colour. The wavy fur is more of a white and a really soft cream. The curly fur is a bit of a light brown with a little hint of orange, and the wiry fur is a bit of an off-white. So I've got a few different types of fur colours, but that's not going to be the main focus of this tutorial, so there is no sort of colour list or anything for these types of fur. I'm mainly just showing you the technique for these types of fur. So there's no specific colour list because you can apply these techniques to any coloured fur, not just the ones that I'm showing you. So just to be clear, no colour list, no reference, no line drawing, sorry. The reference which I've set out I will include for you, but there's no line drawing and there's no pencil list. So we're going to start with the short fur, and then we're going to work on the long fur and then work our way down through each circle. So for the short fur, what you really need to do before you start any drawing is you need to look at that reference photo and you need to decide which direction the fur is going in. So really take your time and study the direction of the fur. So on the circle example which I've set out for you, the fur is actually coming upwards in this direction. And then you've got a little bit of fur that sort of comes out to this way as well. But a majority of it is just coming upwards. So what we need to do is take our base layer, and for the black fur I'm going to go straight in with some warm grey 1. And what we're going to do is just shade to begin with in that direction that you've just deciphered from that reference photo. So all we're going to do is just shade the entire circle or whatever kind of section you're working on. And we're just going to add this pencil down according to that reference. So I'm just roughly shading down using really light pressure. So I'm using light pressure by holding my pencil quite far back. I'm not holding it towards the point like this. I'm holding it quite far back here so that I can allow myself to limit the pressure that I put through the pencil. So if you have a little play around with holding your pencil in different positions and then putting that pencil down on paper and shading or creating marks, you'll find that by holding your pencil in different areas and by holding it like right far back here and holding it right towards the point, you will be able to create different types of pressures and different types of marks. So it's a really good idea for you guys to just play around with the positioning of your pencil in your hand to see what kind of marks and what kind of shading and all that kind of thing that you can create. So to create this sort of light shading, I'm just sort of holding my pencil in the middle of the barrel and just really lightly shading that over. So I've just got one nice layer. The colour and tone is nice and consistent all the way across it. Like so. So then what you want to do, you want to slowly build up the layers just using shading to begin with. So I'm going to layer some of the cold grey 1 for my black fur, But again, this can be applied to any coloured fur, so I tend to usually do a couple layers of shading and then go in and start to add the details. So with this next layer, I am adding it in exactly the same direction as what I've just added for the previous layer. So I'm going straight over that warm grey one with the cold grey one in the direction that that fur is going in. So we've already sort of mapped out the direction with that warm grey one, that initial layer. And then we're just going over with the warm grey one and just developing the tone of the fur. So if you was to create white fur with short fur, what you would do is just layer your base layer. So for white fur I tend to use a warm grey one, and then I would just build up that warm grey one and then introduce a few darker colours towards the end. So for the second layer, if you're wanting to create white fur, I would just build up with the warm grey one once more. So I'm just going over and just making sure I've got a nice consistent even tone across that entire circle, like that. So I've got all of the shading and everything going up. I haven't sort of shaded off to the side like this, I've just shaded going in one direction. Following that fur, it curves ever so slightly here, so I've just gone off at a bit of a curve just here. So then what I want to do is start to build up those darker tones. So for the black fur, I'm just going to go straight in with the dark sepia. But what you would do if you was creating this with another coloured fur is to just slowly build up to your darker colours. So if you was doing that sort of wheaty colour, which you can see on the long fur, you'd build up from the lightest ones, probably being the warm grey one, a little bit of cream, and then you'd go into sort of your sort of burnt ochres, that kind of colour, building up to your darker colours, which would most likely be nougat and walnut brown. But for this coloured fur, we're going straight in with the dark sepia, and again I'm using that shading method and just really lightly layering this down. So you can see I'm holding my pencil in exactly the same place as the previous, and I'm just shading this down really lightly in the direction that the fur's going in. So with this, you can see the kind of motion and the sort of shading, what my shading is actually creating onto the page. So I'm not using really long and big shading strokes. I'm using small, short, back and forth motions with that pencil. So it's really, really short. I apologise for the noise in the background if you can hear it. Having a little bit of work done, and it's the only time I've got to record, and just so happens that there is building work being going on, so I apologise if you can hear any sort of drilling or anything like that in the background. So continuing with the explanation for this, I'm just using really short shading. So I'm not doing really long exaggerated shading motions. I'm doing quite short ones. I'm keeping the pressure off my pencil and just keeping those sort of shading marks really short. So you'll notice that when we get on to doing the long fur, that I actually increase the length of those initial shading marks. So it's really important when you are doing short fur to keep all of your marks really short. If you was to start to do long strokes or anything like that, it would make the fur look too long, and obviously it's short fur, so you want to keep your marks and everything quite short. So it's just using your common sense and keeping your short fur strokes really short. So I'm just going over the entire circle, just really lightly shading with this. So just going back and forth, just creating really short shading motions, just following the direction of the fur. and then just making sure that I follow any sort of lines or directions that the fur is going in. If it's just coming off at a slight different angle just here, so I've just sort of made sure that I'm going in that sort of direction just there as well. So really pay attention to your reference photo. Okay, so you can see that the tone is a little bit uneven, and that's just because we've gone in with that darker colour, and we're going to even that up with further layers anyway. What you can do if you want to, you can burnish that out with a white pencil just to sort of blend everything together and even out the tone a little bit, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go straight in with another layer of my dark sepia. So again, for another coloured fur, so for like that wheaty coloured fur that you've got on the long fur, you'd go in with your next darker colour, but because I'm doing black fur, I don't have a next darker colour, but you're going to see the tone build up with the dark sepia, which is this kind of the same as just using another pencil. So with this layer we're going to use a similar sort of motion, but this time I'm going to hold my pencil quite far towards the point because I want a bit more of a controlled pressure, because I'm going to start to really build up the fur tone now. So with this layer I like to go in and add some fur lines because that helps to really build the colour and it starts to build the texture of the fur, which is what we want to start doing. So with this layer, instead of doing that shading, I'm creating really tiny fur lines. So all I'm doing is just putting my pencil down onto the paper like this, and then I'm just lifting as I go, so I'm creating a tapered line. So I'm just creating these types of lines and making them overlap ever so slightly. So by overlap, I don't mean going over and going horizontally. I mean just ever so slightly bending them towards the end, just kind of just letting my pencil sort of do its magic and do what it wants, and just being a little bit free. So I'm trying not to control the direction of the pencil too much, because if you control your pencil too much, it's going to make your fur look really contrived and it's going to look unrealistic. So you want to sort of just be free with the pencil, try not to put too much pressure through it to begin with, and just slowly build up that fur texture by creating these small, short fur lines. So at the moment it doesn't really matter about tones or anything, we're just trying to build an overall tone. And with short fur you don't have to worry about mapping out anything, because you can go in and darken certain areas if you need to. Whereas when you're working on long or wavy fur, you'll see that we use a different technique and we go in and map all of the darker parts out and then go in. Whereas with short fur, just work in a slightly different way. I just find this is a lot easier. Short fur is one of those ones that is super easy to render, and it's a really simple technique to render it as well. So you can see that we're sort of building that tone and building that texture on this side. So I'm just going to bring that over the entire circle. So another thing that is important when you are creating fur lines is to keep your pencil really nice and sharp. So if you notice that your pencil is starting to blunt and that your fur lines perhaps aren't quite as prominent as they were, then just give your pencil a little sharpen, and sharpen in whichever manner you feel comfortable with. A lot of people like to just sharpen with a sharpener, but some people like to try and preserve their pencil as much as possible and use a sanding block just to get that sharp point onto the end. Whichever method you find useful and the most advantageous for your work, use whichever method that you use for sharpening. So when you're creating short fur, you need to make sure that you do keep those fur strokes really nice and short. So you don't want to create really long ones, because that's going to give you the illusion that the fur is really long. So you want to create nice short fur lines, and you want to create quite a few of them. Just group them over one another, work in the direction that the fur is going in. You can see that the fur is going up this way, this bit slightly curving off towards this side here. So you can see that my pencil just needs a little bit of a sharpen. It's not as sharp as it was. So from my sharpener, I'm using the Derwent Superpoint Mini. It's just a mechanical sharpener and it gets a really nice sharp point on my pencil. So all I'm going to do is then just continue with those fur lines, just work them in the direction that the fur is going in. So just pay close attention to that reference photo. Just really look at the fur direction and everything. So just really building those really small fur lines, and you can really see the texture really starting to come to life now. And then when we add further layers, you'll get rid of all this sort of grainy look, and it will start to come together and look a lot smoother and sleeker, which is what we want for this particular reference. So you can also work your fur coming down as well as up, and that will just help to create a more sort of really nice fur texture. So if you are having trouble, especially if your work is taped down like mine, if you're having trouble just getting to a certain angle and you need to sort of come down into the fur, that's completely fine as well. Just use the same motion with your pencil, create that little flick at the end, and everything's going to blend together and you're going to create a really nice fur texture on that. So don't be worried to come down, as long as you're not going across and at a completely weird and different angle to what the rest of the fur is doing. It's going to look natural and it's going to sort of come together. So make sure that everything's always working in the same direction and nothing weird is coming across or overlapping or going in a completely weird direction. Try and make sure that everything is flowing in a consistent direction. So just got this last little bit here to do. So just remember to keep your fur strokes really nice and short. It does take a lot to fill in a section, just creating all of these fur lines all over, but it does give a really nice effect. So just persevere. If your wrist starts aching from creating so many lines, then just take a little break, come back to it. But you'll see just by adding another couple of layers in a second that everything's going to sort of come together. Okay, so we've got a nice layer of short fur lines over there. So now we're going to I'm going to sharpen my pencil up and regain that point. And we're going to start to add in some of the areas of tone. So now we've got a nice overall tone. So now we can start to add some of the darker areas. So to add those sort of darker areas, all we're going to do is just layer once more, but we're going to cluster the fur strokes a little bit closer together. So we're going to start on the left hand side here. We've got a little dark patch just here. So all we're going to do is make sure we've got a sharp pencil. You're going to gently increase the pressure on your pencil as well to try and burnish everything together. You're going to still use those really tiny fur lines, but this time you're going to cluster them together a little bit more. So by cluster them together, I mean sort of really overlap them, really create those really short fur lines and just overlap them to really build that tone. So you're looking at the reference photo and you're seeing where that darker tone is and adding it in like that. And then to blend that into the surrounding areas, all we're going to do is use exactly the same fur lines, but we're going to lessen the pressure through the pencil and we're just going to blend it into the surrounding area. And you're also going to use less fur lines to blend that out as well. So don't cluster your fur lines too close together like we have been doing to build that darker tone. You're just going to lessen the pressure and decluster those fur lines. So I'm just going over with a secondary layer and just darkening once more. Again, making sure that I keep my fur lines really nice and short. I'm not creating really long fur lines. And making sure that I blend it into the surrounding area as well. Okay, so we've got our first darker patch there. So we're going to move on and do this darker patch just down here. So we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're just going to cluster our fur lines real close together and increase the pressure on the pencil. And that's just going to help to burnish everything out. And we're just going to create these dark sections, so really pay attention to that reference photo. If you need a little bit of help distinguishing where those darker areas are, then my top tip is to always squint at your reference photo, because that really brings out those light and those dark areas. So have a squint at your reference photo. See where those darker areas are, what sort of jumps out at you, and then add that down with the pencil and those fur lines. So again, make sure that you are always following the fur direction as well when you're doing this. You don't want to come off at a weird angle. You want to always make sure, I've got something underneath my paper there which is really quite annoying. You want to always make sure that you are always working in that direction of the fur. So you can see we're creating a really dark tone here. Just going to bring this towards the edge of the circle as well. So I'm just still making sure that I use really tiny fur lines, just really building that tone. So you can see that the pencil gets really quite blunt. So you need to make sure that you maintain that sharp point as well. So once you've got a nice sharp pencil, then you can start to add in more fur lines and create these darker patches. So if you're having trouble getting it to the sort of depth and the required darkness according to that reference photo, then just increase the pressure on your pencil slightly. You're not going to be adding very much definition or anything over this, so increasing the pressure and sort of burnishing a little bit to get that depth of colour is not going to worry, because you're not going to need that tooth of the paper to add any sort of details or anything over the top. So don't worry if you're pushing too hard and sort of getting rid of the tooth. As long as you've got the required depth and the required darkness down, that's all that really matters. So to get this bit really dark underneath here, what I'm going to do is just shade a little bit on top of that, because as I said, there's no real sort of definition in that area, so just shading on top is just going to help to lay down that colour and to get it as dark as we need to. I just need to get rid of this. There's something underneath my paper, it's just created a horrible looking dark splodge there. So when I'm shading on top and creating that required depth, I'm just working in the direction that the fur is going in, so I'm not going off at any weird angle at all. So you can see that this bit down here is really dark, so we need to start to bring this sort of darker fur up here, and then we need to blend it out as well. So I'm just bringing up a few more fur lines up here, making sure that I keep them really short because it's short fur, we don't want really long lines. So creating really short fur. And obviously you need to scale the size of your fur lines to whatever you're drawing. So if something you are drawing is really quite small, then obviously you need to make smaller lines. So when you're making short fur, you don't want to create the same length lines as, say, if you don't want to create the same size lines as something that you're creating here if something you're working on is smaller, because then it's going to look like it has long fur. So when you're creating smaller pieces or large pieces, you need to make sure that you do actually scale your fur strokes. And just paying attention to your reference photo is going to help you with that. It's going to help you identify how long you need to make things. And if you're having trouble, the good tip is to measure the length of the fur against a prominent feature. So measure the length of the fur line against an eye or a nose or something, and then apply that length that you can see in that reference photo to your drawing. So reference the fur against a main reference point, and that will gauge how long you need to make your fur strokes and everything like that. So you can see I'm just sort of building the darker tones towards the top here now, just adding in a few clumps here and there where it's a little bit darker. So I'm just paying real close attention to that reference photo, adding in these darker fur lines and really creating this sort of darker areas now as well. So again, you can see that my pencil's getting quite blunt, so I need to resharpen. And you're going to see that a sharp pencil helps create those really defined fur lines, and it really does help to blend everything out properly as well. So what we're going to start to do is to blend everything out. So to do that, we're just going to lessen the pressure on the pencil and create those fur lines to help to blend everything together. So work around the outside of those darker areas and just lift the pressure off your pencil to help to blend everything. So just using those really short fur lines to just blend everything together. And then just working back through and just adding in any darker areas, so just going back over with another layer and darkening anything up. So as I said, if you're using or working with a different coloured fur, all you would do is just slowly build to your darker colours. But this is more about the technique of applying the fur to your drawing rather than just working through the colours. So I'm just creating these clumps of darker areas now, and sort of blending them out into the surrounding area. And then just shading as well to help to blend everything together and to get this bit down here as dark as necessary. So in a second I'm going to blend with the white pencil just to try and bring everything together and make it really nice and smooth. At the moment I'm just making sure that I just go over a few areas, just creating those really short fur lines, just darkening up everything where necessary. I'm just trying to make sure that everything is really nice and blended as well. So in these lighter areas through the top here, just going to take the white pencil and just blend this out slightly. It's going to help to just smush all of that colour together. So by blending, all I'm doing is just running the white pencil over really lightly, so I'm using a light pressure here, just running the pencil over. It's going to knock back the colour a little bit, but that's going to be okay because we're going to go over and add another further layer of the dark sepia. So just making sure that everything's nice and blended out. You can also use the warm or cold grey to blend, but I really like to use this Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil. I'm not going to bother to blend into that darker area because it's going to knock that colour back, and just want to keep it as dark as possible, so that bit's fine. And then we're just going to go back in with the dark sepia pencil and build that colour and the areas up a little bit more. We're also going to add some of the walnut brown and some dark indigo as well to build those blue tones, which you can see on the reference picture. So again, got a nice sharp pencil, and I'm just going to go over. Just create those short fur lines once more, and you'll see that once you've blended out like this, you get a nice surface to work upon, and everything looks really nice and smooth. So really paying attention to that reference photo now and really adding in these fur lines where necessary, where it's darker, and then making sure that you blend them out into the surrounding areas as well. So really making sure that we pay attention to that reference photo is really crucial in adding in your dark and light areas. So this right hand side is a little bit darker than the left hand side, and there's like a few pockets of dark fur as well, or that darker toned black fur. So we're really adding in these fur lines to just darken this appropriately. So remember, throughout this you need to keep your fur strokes really short. Like so. So all we need to focus on is this area up here, and this bit's a lot lighter, so we don't need to add too many darker sections through this area. But we're just going to add another layer of fur lines through there, so keeping it really nice and short, making sure that we're blending out into the surrounding areas where there are those darker patches as well. So in a moment what we're going to do is go through and add some of the dark indigo and the walnut brown, just to tone up a few areas. There's a little bit of like a blue tint to this fur. So adding that dark indigo is just going to help to add that sort of tint. And it's going to help to add a little bit of sheen to the fur as well. So we're almost done. So you can see that this fur looks quite short and it's not long or wavy or anything. You can tell that it's short fur. You can tell that it's got short strands. You can tell that it's like when you run your fingers through it that it's not going to be really soft and silky. It's going to be really quite short and coarse. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading using the side of my pencil here to darken this bit up to where it needs to be, because this bit down here is really dark. And with that shading I'm just making sure that I sort of blend that out into the surrounding area as well. So I'm just using the side of the pencil to add that initial colour down and then blending out into the surrounding area. So this area on the bottom is your darkest area, and then as you come up through the fur at the top here it gets a lot lighter. And that's sort of the gradation that we've got going on here as well. It's darker at the bottom, it gradually gets lighter, and then you've got these little pockets of darker fur as well where we're just adding in these fur lines, so grouping your fur lines together a little bit more to kind of create that darker tone. And it's looking perfect there. So now what we're going to do is just layer over a little bit of the dark indigo. So to do that I'm just going to use the side of the pencil just to glaze that colour over into those lighter areas, and I'm also going to work that colour into the darker areas as well, just so that everything is tied together, all the tones are consistent throughout the piece. So you can see that adding that sort of blue tone down just gives it a little bit of an extra sheen. And to bring out that sheen we can also go in and add a little bit of white. I'm also going to add a little bit of Delft blue. So I'm just adding those two variations of blue just to try and add that really nice sheen down, and adding this blue into the darker area. When we add that brown, that walnut brown in, it's going to add another level of depth to those darker areas. So just adding the Delft blue, just shading using the side of the pencil, glazing that colour over those darker areas. You can see that it's already giving that another level of colour, and then going over with that walnut brown, creating that further level of depth in there, adding the brown throughout the fur as well. So creating and layering brown and blue together creates a really nice dark tone. So if you're ever stuck for darkening anything and you want to create a little bit more depth, then I would recommend layering some blue and some walnut brown. So any kind of blue will do, but the two blues that I like to use are the dark indigo and the Delft blue. So to create some of those more sort of highlighted areas, all we can do is go in with a white pencil and sort of blend this out a little bit more. So you want to make sure you've got a nice sharp white pencil, and all we're going to do is just blend this out. It's going to bring that blue out a little bit more as well and create a really nice sort of vibrant shine. So with this white, I'm not going in and adding any sort of fur line shading or anything. I'm creating fur lines with this, and it's just going to help to blend everything together. I can add in those lighter areas as well that sort of intersect into this darker area down here. So just creating really short fur lines, and it's just going to create a little level of highlight within that fur down there. You can see it sort of blends everything together as well. Creates a really lovely tone. So just adding really short fur lines, just grouping them together where you've got some sort of lighter areas. This also helps to blend those darker areas out as well. So always making sure that we're working in the direction of the fur, So make sure that you don't work at any odd angles with the white pencil, because it's going to make your fur look really unnatural. Unless of course you've got an overlaying white hair or something that is going at a bit of an odd angle. But for the majority of the piece you want to make sure that you are working in the direction that the fur is going in. I'm also just going to bring a few white lines down into this darker area. Just to add that little element of texture down there. So once you've got everything sort of blended out like that, you can then go in with further layers and just continue to build and to layer and to get your fur looking as natural as possible. So it does take a little bit of time to just layer up your colours. But if you follow these techniques for building short fur, just by using some shading to begin with to get those initial layers and your initial foundation of colour down. If you're working with another coloured fur, then make sure that you obviously work from light to dark and just follow the same process, so just gently layering, gently adding some fur lines, but just making sure that you're working from your lighter colours into your darker colours. So that's pretty much it for short fur. I can continue to just work over it and to blend out areas, but I'm pretty much happy with how that's looking. Everything's sort of flowing in the same direction. All of my fur lines are nice and short. It doesn't look like long fur, it looks like really short sort of fur that is in on the forehead of an animal, that kind of facial fur is what we're going for here. If I want to, I can always go in with a black pencil and add some really dark areas down. So I'm just going to add a little bit of black to this bit down the bottom here, and I'm going to run a few little black fur lines through here in these darker areas. So black is one of the last colours that I add for black fur. So everything that we've sort of built up to at the moment is just built with the dark sepia. But to get those really dark elements in, I like to go in with that black pencil at the very end. Just add it in those darkest areas that I couldn't get with the dark sepia. Making sure that I blend these black areas out into the surrounding fur as well. So make sure that your pencil's sharp when you're adding your final dark layer down, and make sure that you only add your dark layer down into the areas that actually need it. So don't add any dark colours into your lighter areas. And just remember to keep your fur strokes really short as well. So I'm just going to bring a few more white lines down into these lighter areas here and just sort of segment these darker areas a little bit more. So I'm just continuing to use those really short fur lines, keeping everything really short. Don't want it to go and use long fur lines and make everything look really super furry. I want to make everything look nice and short and smooth and sleek. So I think we're pretty much done for the short fur in the way of explaining techniques and everything to you. So you want to make sure that you use these types of fur lines. You want to make sure that everything's nice and short. Don't use any sort of long fur lines. Make sure that everything is going in the same direction. So pay attention to that reference photo at the very beginning and sort of map in your mind which direction everything is going in, and then apply that to your drawing and follow that with your subsequent layers as well. So we're ready to move on to the long fur now, and that sort of follows the same sort of pattern as the short fur, but instead we're going to use those longer fur motions with the pencil, and we're also going to map in a few of the real sort of dark clumps first as well. So we're going to move straight on to the long fur here. So for the long fur, we're going to start off doing exactly the same thing as we did with the short fur, and that is to look at the direction that the fur is actually going in. So the short fur was going up, and this long fur, I've pictured it so that it is coming this way. So what we need to do is put down our base layer going in that direction. So what we're going to do is just put down a really light layer of the warm grey one in that direction, so coming this way. It comes at a very slight angle downwards as well. So what I'm going to do to begin with is just very lightly mark in the direction that's actually going in. So you've got that bit that comes down here, and then you've got another clump, so I'm just sort of filling in the clumps to begin with. And then you've got another bit here that just comes down a little bit more at a sharper angle. And then this bit up here just comes off right off at a diagonal like that. And the same up here. So we've got our directions mapped out there. So then all we need to do is just follow those directions in each individual clump and shade them in that direction. So we need to make sure that we follow the sort of curvature of this one here, so it's just coming ever so slightly down. So I've got a sharp pencil, and all I'm doing is just lightly shading this in to meet the edges of the circle there. And just filling all of these individual parts in as well. So just using that light pressure, just shading in all of these clumps. So making sure that I use that consistent tone across the entire area. So then what I'm going to do is take one of our darker colours, or the darkest colour, which is the walnut brown in this case, and all I'm going to do is just gently map out and go back over those clumps. So if we start from this side, you can see that there is an area here, so I'm just sort of mapping that out. And then it comes down this bit here, so you need to make sure that everything sort of flows off of one another as well. So just using a light pencil enables you just to sort of map out those clumps to begin with. And I'm also just going to add in a very light area of shading where necessary as well. So you can just add a little bit of light shading down here, and a little bit of shading through the top here as well. So I'm just using really light pressure on the pencil just to add that shading down, making sure that I work in the direction that the fur is going in. We're just mapping out the main sort of clumps and everything that I can see, just using light pressure on the pencil. So just working my way across the reference. Just adding in any sort of individual lines as well. So just really spending the time just to map out all of these darker areas. Just following the direction that the fur is going in. So just using that shading technique. I'm also making sure that the sort of shading method which I use has much longer strokes than the short fur. So for the short fur we did quite small ones, some really short fur lines as well, but for this one I'm making sure that those shading marks are really long, and I'm trying to make them as long as these sort of clumps are, and just trying to add the correct sort of stroke with the pencil down. So you can see I'm making them really quite long to try and mimic that sort of long fur vibe. So we've got all of the individual clumps mapped out. So you should have something that sort of looks like this, and it sort of looks a little bit higgledy-piggledy, looks a bit like it's jigsaw and really sort of rough. So now we can start to fill in some of the lighter values. So I'm going to use a luminance colour for this sort of toned fur, this sort of like wheaty toned fur, and I'm going to use the brown ochre 10%. I'm going to pretty much put this all over this entire piece. So again, I'm making sure that I work in the direction that these clumps are going in. It's much easier to see which direction they're going in now that we've got that sort of tone down with that walnut brown pencil. And just shading pretty much all over here, making sure that I do actually shade over the walnut brown areas as well. So I'm just shading back and forth, keeping the strokes quite long and fluid. Okay, so I'm going to go over with a secondary layer of this pencil, and I'm going to start to work this into the sort of more shadowy, sort of darker toned areas. So you can see a lot of light areas on this reference, so I'm going to leave those free of the brown ochre 10% for now, and just sort of work over these darker toned areas. So all I'm doing for this is just still using that shading motion with the pencil. This will start to blend everything together and make it a lot more smooth, so you won't get that sort of grainy look where you've got the white of the paper showing through. So this will start to eliminate that. So with the shading, I'm just sort of making sure that it's nice and fluid. Some areas might be using some short shading, but making sure that I blend that out into the surrounding areas as well. That's just going to help with the blend later on as well. So just working it into the sort of darker toned areas, leaving the lighter ones free. So still using that shading motion. So it's still looking really rough. But the more colours we start to add into the fur and really sort of segment it and add some fur lines down, it's going to start to bring it all together. So I'm also trying to add a few really long fur lines here and there just to help to blend those darker areas out into that lighter area. So similar to what we did over here on the short fur, we sort of added those fur strokes into the lighter areas to blend those darker areas out. So I'm doing exactly the same thing, except instead of using really short strokes, I'm just elongating my pencil strokes and making quite long fluid ones. So I'm always making sure that I'm working in the direction that the fur's going in. So you can start to see where you've got some highlights and where you've got some lowlights now. So I'm going to switch to the next colour, which is going to be the raw umber, or possibly the Beaster. I might just use a combination of both, but I'm just going to go in to these sort of darker areas with the raw umber and just start to darken them up. And this time I'm going to start to go in with some of the fur lines that we were sort of semi-using on the previous layer. But this time we are actually going to introduce some long fur lines moving in the direction that the fur is going in. I might actually use the Beaster. The raw umber seems to be a bit too yellow, so I'm going to use the Beaster pencil. And I'm just going to work this dark pencil into where you've got these clumps, where we've defined all those darker parts. So the main dark part is this one just here. So I'm mainly going to work into this one. So you need to make sure that you follow the fur direction of this one. We also need to make sure that we use those long fluid lines to help bring the essence of the long fur in there. And what I'm going to do is just bring this beaster, I'm going to use some really light shading to just blend the areas between that really dark section and the lighter section together. So some of the clumps do actually call for some shorter fur lines, especially where you've got a little bit of sort of intersecting fur. It's where the fur's parted a little bit and you've got just this tiny hint of sort of shadow and everything through there. So you do need to use some smaller fur lines in that respect. But for the general flow of the fur, everything needs to be quite long. I'm just making sure that I'm working over each area, just adding down a really nice layer of colour and making sure that I blend it out as well. So the blending out is one of the important aspects here. So we're really starting to build these darker tones, these darker clumps. So just continuing with fur lines. So I'm also going to start to add some of these fur lines through the rest of the fur as well. So you can start to see everything sort of coming together now. Just shading in all of these darker sections, blending out using those long fluid fur lines. So just working on these larger clumps at the top here. So I'm making these long lines. What I'm making sure that I do is taper off the edge like I did here, but I'm elongating that taper. So I'm not lifting my pencil directly off the paper when I'm making those lines. Instead what I'm doing is just moving the pencil along the paper so it really lightly blends out so you get that really long stroke. So you can start to see all of these individual sections now. It's starting to look a lot more like fur rather than just a sort of weird scribbly mess. So what we need to do now is go in with another dark colour. So I'm actually going to go in with some of the burnt ochre, and I'm going to add this into those darker areas because there's a bit of an orange tone. But instead of adding this down in the manner of fur lines, I'm just going to just gently shade some of this into these areas. So I'm just going to just shade using the side of the pencil because my pencil's quite short and I can't really hold it quite far back as I would like. I'm just using the side of the pencil and just gently laying down that colour, letting that colour just come off onto the paper, using the side of my pencil like this. Just adding down that really nice sort of gingery tone into that wheaten toned hair there. So then I'm going to use the burnt sienna, and I'm going to start to add this into those real darker areas, and this is also going to help me to blend all of the other areas together as well. So you want to make sure throughout this entire process that you have completely sharp pencils. Those sharp pencils is what is going to get you these really defined, really prominent fur lines. So I'm just looking for the relevant tones within the reference picture and just adding those into those areas. And I'm also just adding a few of these fur lines and everything through the fur just to give it a little bit of extra dimension, as to tie all of the areas together as well. So just shading some of those tones down there, shading a little bit of it through some of the main body of the fur as well. And then what I'm going to go in and do is lay down some more of the walnut brown and really darken some of these areas up. So mainly through this bit's really dark through here, and I'm making sure that on this occasion when I'm adding the walnut brown through is to add a lot of these really long silky fur lines through the rest of the fur as well. So really adding this into the shadow areas. Which is mainly just down here, this main shadow area just down here. So just really adding this tone through the fur, just making sure that we keep those fur strokes really long and fluid. Okay, so Now what I need to do is go through with the white pencil and just blend a few areas out and highlight them. So again, still making sure that we use a sharp pencil and make sure we use these really fluid motions with the pencil so we get that element and sort of indication that this fur is really long. And I'm just going to work slightly into some of those darker areas just to help with that blend. And I'm also just going to shade over some of these colours through this fur just to really smoothen them out. Really get that really nice soft silky look that you get with this long fur here. So what would help this fur as well is to add a little element of green. That's really going to help to bring this fur together. So after we've blended out a little bit with the white pencil, then we can go back in and adjust some of the areas. So adjust the brighter areas and the darker areas. Make sure that everything's sort of tying together properly. So what we're doing is just making sure that we smooth all of these areas out. Lighten up any areas that have sort of got a little bit too dark. So that's mainly just this area just here. And we can go back in and we can darken. I'm going to use the burnt sienna just to add a little bit of shading here and there. So I just need to add a little bit more. A bit more shading here. And I'm going to use that burnt ochre 10% to help to add a little bit more of that wheaten tone as well to a few areas. So just going over a few areas with the existing tones that we've been using. So mainly the Bistre and the burnt ochre 10%. Just going to help to blend everything together as well. And just going to squint at the reference picture, squint at what I've drawn, and just see if all of the tones and everything are matching up. And if they're not, just going to adjust them slightly. The main thing to get right is to get the contrast and everything correct within your piece. So just having a squint at your reference picture and then at your drawing and just seeing where those sort of contrast elements need to be adjusted. So see what areas are really popping out at you, and then just add your relevant pencils down in those areas. So I'm going to use a little bit of the raw umber for that yellow tone, and just add a little bit of shading next to these darker areas, just to give that a little sort of brassy tone to this fur. So I'm just shading this down. I'm just using the side of the pencil, holding it quite far back to limit the amount of pressure I'm putting through, and just really lightly adding this tone down over the area of fur here. So I'm quite happy with how this is starting to look. So to sort of bring some of the colours out, I mentioned about using a little bit of green, and the green that I'm going to use is the olive green yellowish. This is one of my favourite greens to add to this toned fur, and I'm only going to add a hint of this into those sort of darker areas and add a few strands next to those darker areas. So this is just going to help to bring out those sort of coppery tones that you can see in there. Orange, yellow and green work really well together, and it's really good to add your green into your shadows. I'm just going to add a few lines of it through this fur as well. So I feel like it just really complements it. There we go. So I'm pretty happy with how that fur is looking. If I need to, I can just continue to make adjustments, but the basis of this fur is to use the shading method to begin with, map out the direction that your fur and if there are any clumps within your long fur. So a lot of long fur, there won't actually be as many clumps as this. I sort of use this as a worst case scenario for your long fur, but a lot of long fur is just really long and flowy, and you won't necessarily have to map out any dark areas like we've done here. But if your fur is like this, then I've shown you the process on how to do that. But generally long fur tends to be unclumpy, like just really nice, soft and flowy and silky. So all you need to remember to do is just to add your base layers, add and start to build up your shadows. That's the premise of this, and obviously to make sure that you do use longer fur strokes and longer shading strokes, so much longer than your short fur strokes. So it's really important to remember to scale your fur strokes to the size that you're working, because obviously not all your strokes are going to want to be the same length, because you're going to work on different sizes, and if you're doing really long fur strokes on something quite small, then it's just going to look really kind of scribbly and it will just look like one piece of fur. So you need to scale your fur strokes like you would do with the short fur. You need to scale them to the size that you're actually working from. That's really important as well to remember. But that's pretty much it. I'm just continuing to adjust a few areas here, just sort of really hyping up the contrast. This is more along the lines of, like I said, a worst case scenario for your fur. Most of the long fur that you come across is just really nice, long and flowy, but this is sort of ties in with the wavy fur and the curly fur. It's the same sort of process, but I just thought I would show you the worst case for drawing your long fur in this manner. So we're going to move straight on to doing the wavy fur. And that is a similar process to this long fur, but obviously you've got a lot more sort of controlled waves and everything within this fur. So let's move straight on to that one. So this kind of follows the same principle as the long fur here. So what we're going to do before we put down any sort of base layer, we're just going to gently map out where you've got these different kind of waves. So it's a little wavier than the long fur, and there's a little bit more of like an overlay and a crisscross of some of the fur pattern there. But the principle is exactly the same. So all we need to do is just gently map out where you've got all these different waves. So we're going to start at this one up here, and it comes down into this corner here, and it just follows like a curve like that. So we've got our first one, if you can just make out that line there. And then you've got another segment that comes just like this, and then another bit comes off of that. So you just need to follow the lines and sort of just mapping in the darkest areas is what we're doing here. So So you can see that this has a lot more of a wave to it. And the fur direction tends to change quite a lot. So you've got this bit that comes up and around like this. This bit comes off this way. So it's just a little bit of a different fur direction. So just really softly mapping out all of these directions, just using some really broad strokes. Just mapping all of that in. So you can see the directions that some of these are going, and it also helps just to add in 1 or 2 lines just to help you to get that direction. So we're going to work in bit by adding the base layer, because we don't want to lose all of this that we've just mapped out. So what we're going to do is start at the bottom here and work our way up this way. So we're going to fill in this section just here. So what we're going to do is just shade that in the direction that the fur is going in. So we're just going to shade all of this, just following the direction according to that reference photo. So I'm just using some short shading marks to begin with. And then just using some broader ones when I'm much more confident with the direction. So just moving my pencil back and forth across the paper. So we've got that bit filled in there. So as I said, we're going to just build up the colours within this one. So I'm going to switch colours to the warm grey 3, and I'm just going to gently shade in a few areas here, and I'm also just going to start this layer with some fur lines as well, and this will just help to create that really soft feel that you often get with soft waves like this. Just starting to flesh out all of this waviness and just filling in a lot of the darker areas with this pencil as well. So this fur colour is like an apricot type colour, so we're going to be adding some sort of really soft fleshy tones into this, but for the time being just mapping out the direction, just adding in shading and just creating some really long fur lines with this. So this wavy fur is quite long, and often when you have wavy fur on a dog or an animal, it tends to be quite long as well. So you're using exactly the same sort of technique as you would for the long hair, but you're applying it in a different way by just doing it section by section so that you can get those nice flowing waves and so that you don't lose the direction. So I find this a lot easier to do, because if you was to shade in the whole thing, you would lose the direction and it's quite hard to focus on specific areas. So when it's something a little bit more complex like this, I like to go in and just do each section individually like this. So next I'm going to add in these sort of apricot-y colours, and for that I'm going to use 2 luminance colours. So I'm going to use the burnt ochre 10% and also the brown ochre 10%. And now it's important to make sure that the pencils are really sharp, like this. And all I'm going to do is just add this into these darker areas just by creating some fur lines. So I'm using that burnt ochre 10% first, just going into this darker section and just adding in the fur lines in the direction that the fur is going in. So I'm really paying attention to that reference and adding this in the darker sections. You can see it's slowly building that apricot colour there, making sure that I blend that out into the surrounding areas as well. So just going over, just adding these really broad, large, sweeping motions with the pencil. adding this colour to this area up here, and then going in with the brown ochre 10%, so more of the creamy tone, and this is going to help to blend everything together. So just using exactly the same motion with the pencil, just making those sweeping motions back and forth, just following the direction and the flow of that fur. So when I'm creating wavy fur, I like to keep everything really free, so I kind of like to let the pencil do as it pleases, so to speak, and just let it sort of go where it wants to. I'm going to go back in with that burnt ochre 10% and just fill in a few areas down here. So it's just really important to pay attention to that fur direction. That's mainly what we're getting in here. So you've got a slight bit that sort of curls over here. So to do that, all I've done is just worked in a slightly different direction than that fur is going in. So a majority of it is going up like this. So I've just added a few little strokes of the burnt ochre 10% going this way instead of this way. And that just helps to create that sort of concaved look that's going on just there. So now I'm going to switch to the Nougat and add in this darker section here. So again, you want to make sure that you've got a really nice sharp pencil, and I'm just making those same lines, so just adding in some lines at the bottom of this section here where it's nice and dark. And then creating those really long, flowing, wavy lines through the fur. So through the rest of this section here, and just shading this darker section as well. So just repeating and adding some further layers just to try and darken that up as much as I possibly can, and then blending it out into the surrounding areas by lessening the pressure on the pencil to try and really taper it off and blend it in. So now what I'm going to do is just use the Warm Grey 3, and we're going to add a little bit more of a grey tone to some of these areas under here to kind of create that really nice wavy texture. So underneath this section where it's a little bit overlapped, you need to create a nice shadow under here. So the key to knowing where to put these shadows is to look at what the fur is doing and where the light is coming from. So our light source is coming from this direction. So anything that is going up and over underneath is going to be where you've got those shadows. So the lightest part of this is going to be this very top section just here, and you can see that on that reference photo. So you need to add the shadows underneath that area, and you need to darken them and blend them out appropriately. So all you need to do is just really pay attention to that reference photo, work in the direction that the fur is going in, and you'll be able to create some really nice shadows underneath your wavy fur here. So all I'm doing is just adding some fur lines and then adding further layers and increasing the pressure where you've got a few sort of hairs that are darker and a few more sort of more shadowy areas in there. I'm also going to use the Warm Grey 2 to add a few areas of shadow underneath here. So I'm just shading in these shadow areas under here between these sort of apricot-y colours there, and just increasing the shadow on this section as well. Just by using the combination of the Warm Grey 1 and the Warm Grey 2. Sorry, the Warm Grey 2 and the Warm Grey 3. So it's vital to make sure that you maintain a sharp point on your pencil, so if you feel like your pencil is getting a little bit blunt, like mine is here, then make sure that you stop and have a little sharpen of your pencil. So once you've got a nice sharp pencil, you can continue with your fur, and you'll find that your fur strokes are a lot more prominent. The colour lays down a lot easier as well. So just continuing to layer down and create these fur lines with that warm grey 3, and then just filling in some of the shadows through this section as well, just by adding another layer of the nougat and blending that out. So we're going to use the white pencil here as well to help to blend everything together and create a nice smooth look. So you want a nice sharp white pencil, and all we're going to do is just use light pressure and just blend these different areas together. So you want to work in the direction that the fur is going in. You don't want to work in any odd direction or anything like that. We're just blending everything together, making it look really nice and soft and sleek. And then once you've blended out, then you can go in and add any subsequent layers of your darker colours. So you can add a bit more shadow, so you can add some of the grey coming into this brown down here. And I'm also just going to just lead this nougat into this area up here a little bit more and just create that really nice subtle blend and shift in colours there. And the same through this bit as well. So there's our first little section complete. So then we would move on to the next section. So I'm going to do this bit just here. So again, just going to fill in that small section with the shading, so working in the direction that that fur's going in. So nice long shading motion with the pencil. And then we're just going to just go straight in with some burnt ochre with this. And you've got this nice apricot colour at the very edge here. So we're just going to go straight in with this and just fill in this sort of shadowy area down here. So using fur lines for this and a little bit of shading. So using a combination, just using your judgment where you think that you need the shading and where you think you need the fur lines. So the fur lines would be more where it meets this segment just here, and the shading at the very edge just there, where the fur lines and the features aren't really very prominent there. Then we're going to go in with the brown ochre 10% over the areas where we've done that burnt ochre. And again, if you're working on a different coloured fur that is wavy, all you would do is just use the appropriate colours and work in exactly the same way as what I'm doing here. And then lastly, I'm going to take that nougat and we're going to darken this shadow section just here. So just using some lines, and then you've got some really prominent ones just down here. It's not quite at the bottom of that segment of fur though. Just line those in, and then you've got a few here where it touches this bit here. And just adding in some fur lines at the very edge here and blending it into that lighter section in the centre. So we're going to do exactly the same what we did here. We're going to use that white pencil to blend that out and to lighten it a little bit as well. And that's that section pretty much complete. And we're also just going to blend onto that existing section down here, because the blend between these two areas isn't really stark. It's not very noticeable that that is a very subtle shift in the fur direction. So I'm just blending those two together as well. And just going back in and adding any sort of prominent fur lines which I can see poking out there. Going back in with the brown ochre 10%, that more sort of yellowy tone. Just adjusting that shadow just there. So then we move on to the next clump. I'm going to do this bit just here. So working exactly the same process. You want to put your shading, your base layer down to begin with. And this doesn't really have very many of those sort of apricot-y tones. It has a few, so we're just going to really lightly use the burnt ochre and just hint at the subtle shadows and the subtle tones which are in there. So I'm using quite small fur lines for this because this is quite a small little clump of this wavy fur. It's not as large and as broad as this, so I'm not using those really large fur lines. I'm just using some small ones to try and fill in this area here. So I'm just using a little subtle hint of that burnt ochre, but I'm mainly just going to add a few lines of the warm grey 3 through here. So really lightly using this pencil, just working in the direction of the fur. So this is slightly going up at this angle towards here. So we're using the fur and the pencil strokes going in that direction. That's pretty much it for that clump. So then we're going to work on this section just here, so same process, working in the direction of the fur. This one's a lot longer, so we can use those longer, broader fur and shading lines. Now this one has a dark shadow just here, so what we're going to do is go in with the burnt ochre. We're going to start to lay down this darker colour just here. So this is where it meets those other clumps as well. So just add that down. And then we're just going to run a few burnt ochre lines through the rest of that. And directly on top of that, we're just going to add some of the nougat. So we're going to add some lines at the very edge here where you've got a few sort of really individual fur strokes. And then just shade this area where we added that burnt ochre down. So we've got a nice area of shading just there. Gonna just add some of the nougat through the rest of that clump as well. And then we're going to use the warm grey 3 just to shade this up because it's quite dark. And we're going to go over that with some of the brown ochre. And then we're going to blend that out with the white pencil as well. So just really lightly just shading this on top. And go over with some brown ochre. And then going over and blending everything together with that white pencil. So this section requires a little bit of definition down here. So I'm just going to use that nougat pencil just to add the required depth and the required definition just by adding in some fur lines, some little segments here. So just using that reference photo and just deciding where those darker areas are, like that. And then what we need to do is work on the clump up here. So this is quite a large clump, and it's quite blurry towards the edges as well, so there's not really much detail that needs to be added throughout that bit. We're just going to add in, it's like a diamond section, this bit up here. Just missed a bit off of that clump at the top there. So just filling in this diamond shape just here, just working in the direction of the fur. It's going upwards and off to the side, and then just going straight in with that burnt ochre, just adding in some really subtle shading and some subtle tones, not really making any sort of fur lines or anything, just keeping this area, especially as it works towards the top here, just keeping that for shading, but just making sure that I shade around those existing areas so that we get the idea that this is a separate little clump just here. And I'm just going to blend that out with the white, keep it really nice and light in tone, and keep it really sort of blended and blurry looking. And then I'm just going to run some warm grey 2 through that as well. So just adding in some shading at the edges of where these different clumps touch, like I just said. And then just using the warm grey 3 just to add in this small shadowed section just here where it meets this other clump. So we're going to continue that when we add this bit just here in a second. But for now that's pretty much done. We can just go over with some of the brown ochre and just tone it up a little bit. I'm just going to work back into some of these clumps with that warm grey 3 just to create these sort of overlapping shadows like that. So this next section is this big section just here. I'm going to add that in. So we're going to use our warm grey 1 and work in the direction of this large triangle clump here, or diamond shape. I'm going to work all the way to the edge of this one as well. Okay, so with this one we're going to go again straight in with that burnt ochre, and we're going to add this apricot stripe that runs down the centre of this clump. So just using the sharp point of the pencil and just creating some fur lines just to add that colour down to the paper. And then where this clump meets these other ones, I'm just going to add the burnt ochre just to sort of signify the outline there. Add a little bit of shading, and then add some shading through the top here as well. And we're going to go straight in with the warm grey 3, and we're going to go over where we've added this sort of burnt ochre at the edges here. Just add some shading in the direction that the fur is going, so it's coming off at this angle here. So just really subtle shading, and then adding some through the bottom here as well. So just really lightly shading with the pencil, just try and fill that in. Just working back and forth in the direction that the fur is going in. I'm going to switch to the Nougat and add a variety of tone in here. So I'm going to add the Nougat over where we've added that warm grey 3. So you can see that there's this pocket of dark fur or darker shadowed type fur just forming just here. We're going to use the nougat to just come down the middle where we've added that burnt ochre as well, and create some fur lines and texture throughout the bottom here. We're going to blend that with the white pencil all over, working in the direction of the fur, give it a nice soft blended effect. And then we can go over and adjust any colours. So I'm going to introduce some of the brown ochre to the very centre here, just to sort of tie it into the rest of the areas, and at the side here as well. But that is pretty much it for the clump. There's not too much sort of definition going on. We can add a few more defined lines with the nougat. When we've blended out, it's those sort of real defined or more defined areas have sort of lost. So we can go back in with some nougat and add a little bit of texture like that. But for the majority of that clump, that's pretty much done. So I'm just going to add a little bit more brown ochre. Got this very small section just here which is just coming off at this angle, so just going to add that small section in. So base layer of the warm grey 1. We're going to go straight in with the warm grey 2, and we're just going to add the shadow at the very side here and at the bottom of that clump. And this larger clump, this one that we've just done, comes right down into it. And then just add all of the shadow which you can see on the reference. It's not that much dark tone going on in this little clump here, but we'll just go in and add a few sort of details with the warm grey 3. So just darken up this section just here. Just run a few lines for a bit of definition through there, and then we can blend that out with the white pencil. Get it to look really nice and soft. So you can see that by working in clumps we're able to identify each individual section and dedicate some time to creating the necessary tones and the necessary texture and everything. So we've just got this last section to do up here, which is quite blurry, and the fur's sort of just coming off like this. It curves around as well, but there's no real sense of direction of this top section. It's really light. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to add a little bit of the cold grey 1 into this section, and we're just going to just gently shade a few areas. So if you squint at the reference photo like I've been telling you to do throughout the other types of fur as well, you can just identify the shadows and everything. So just squint at the reference photo, see where those shadows fall, and then add them appropriately to your drawing. So I'm just adding a few above this clump here. I'm just looking and identifying the shapes as well, and then just fleshing those out. And there's just one sort of darkish shadowy area just here. So I'm just using the burnt ochre for that, and then going over with the nougat really lightly, adding a few darker lines to sort of dissect this section just here as well. We can blend over that with the white and make it look really blurry and out of focus like it is on the reference photo. And that's pretty much it. That's all the sections completed. So all that I would do, and all you need to do now, is just look over the entire thing as an entire patch of fur and make any adjustments that you feel are necessary. So this area just here needs a little bit of shading, so we can add some shading there, and you can go in and darken a few of the shadows where these clumps are meeting. So I'm just using some really light shading motions for this. And using the point of my pencil to get any areas that need a little bit of darkening. So this section just down here just needs to be a touch darker down there. So I'm just going to use a darker brown pencil and just add a light shading down there, just to create the contrast between those real lighter areas and those darker areas. But that's pretty much it for the wavy fur. So you can see the real clumps of fur that are going on in there. You can see just how many different fur directions there are. So that's the technique that I find easiest to use to map all of those sections out. So just working it clump by clump, going bit by bit and just taking our time with it and mapping out each individual section. And then when you're finished, just look at it as a whole and sort of identify what needs adjusting to sort of make it flow a little better together. So you can see I'm just still making adjustments, blending out with the white in a few areas as well where it's looking a little bit softer. And you can just generally just adjust things constantly until you're happy with it. But working with it clump by clump like that makes it a lot easier to manage, rather than you looking at it and thinking, oh my goodness, I really don't know where to start with this and it looks really difficult. But if you work at it clump by clump, it's really not that difficult to actually overcome and actually render a realistic and natural looking wavy fur. So just making my final adjustments there. And you can see that just by adjusting the shadows and everything, it just gives everything a little bit more of a different form. Like so. Okay, so we're going to move straight on to the curly fur, and that is one of, or the hardest to master because you've got all those different curls. It can get a little bit confusing for your eyes as well. So that's what this curly fur is actually going to take us a little bit of time to try and render, but I'll walk you through the process of what I do to create it, and it should make it a lot less daunting and a lot easier for you to render with your own fur. So let's get straight on to this one.